Hello, and welcome to Introductory Logic Lesson 4, where we're going to be talking about methods of defining. Now, there are many different types of methods of defining. The ones that we use most of the time, there's 3 different types. But before we get into that, I wanted to share that Cassiodorus Senator, who lived 480 to 575 BC, identifies 15 different methods of defining terms in his book, An Introduction to Divine and Human Reasonings. 15 different ways. I'm just going to state these really quick. There was notional, qualitative, descriptive, distinguishing, metaphorical, oh my goodness, can't read my own handwriting, negation of the opposite, use of image, statement of what is lacking by way of praise or blame, proportional, relational, causational, and then the 3 that we're going to be talking about. So I just think that's pretty incredible. 480 BC to 575 BC. And it's just crazy to think how there's such a common idea that the ancients were dumb and stupid. And it's just not the case at all. And it's pretty cool to see that in this book, there were 15 different methods of defining. That aside, we're going to talk about 3. So the 3 that we're going to talk about are the 3 main ones that people use on a regular basis. So the first one is defining by synonym. This would be when someone asks, like if someone says, "What is this?" And in response, you give a synonym as an example. This happens a lot when you have kids, because that's how kids often learn. You tell them a word of what it means, but the thing about this one is you have to know what the synonym is. This only works if you give a synonym that the other person understands. And this happens in parenting all the time. Your kid will say, "What is this?" And then you explain it, but you use a word they don't understand, and then you have to explain another word, and so this is an example of that. So for example, if someone says, "What is essential?" you could use necessary, important. Those are synonyms to explain essential. Now, there is a limitation to this rule, and that would fall in line if you think about even synonyms. Now, if you think about when you use synonyms, like when you're writing and you go to a word and you're trying to replace it with a more specific word, you'll see a list of synonyms. And what I do sometimes, or have done in the past, is if I'm doing that, I will look at the synonyms, and then I will go look at the definitions of each of those synonyms. And what you'll find is, because words usually don't have an exact synonym, they'll be similar, but there'll be differences among them, among the different synonyms. And what I will do is look at the definition of each synonym and then determine which of those actually says more clearly and specifically what I'm trying to say. So while this does work, it's not the most exact way of defining a word, but it does work well when you're just trying to give a quick explanation to someone who's trying to understand a word. Like maybe a kid is reading a book, or it's a younger kid and you're trying to explain something. This is by far, we do this all the time. So, but that is an example of a limitation, is that synonyms are not exactly the same most of the time. And an example of this would be if someone says, "What is feline?" and you say cat. That's another example. So that's one way, defining by synonym. A second way is defining by example. This is kind of similar in that we do this a lot. This is how kids learn a lot. You'll give an example of the thing. So an example of this one could be like, if, let's say, an alien walks in and says, "What is a book?" Think about how you would answer that. If there's a book on hand, you might just hold up a book. "This is a book," and show them an example, of what a book is. And this is a lot of times how you would identify things, like when kids, you're pointing to things and you're saying a word with it, like door, guitar, dresser, dog bed. You're pointing to things and giving an example. You're not using words to explain what that thing is. but there's an example there given. So there's two ways of defining by example. One is by demonstration, which is kind of what I just explained, where you're showing them a picture or an item of what that term means. Another way is to list the species of the term. So for example, for vehicle, again, thinking back on my genus and species diagram, the genus is the more broad and the species is underneath it. So vehicle, if we make vehicle the genus and we list all the species underneath it, we're going to list all the types of vehicles there are. This is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I have some listed here. Car, train, plane, boat, bicycle, all of these would be listing the species or the types of vehicle. And vehicle, to go ahead and give you the definition of that, a device or structure for transporting people or things. So you would list all the types of devices or structures for transporting people and things. So those are the two ways of defining by example. Demonstration, show them the thing, or list of the species. Now, when you're listing species of terms, you want them to be comprehensive and list all the terms of all the species. An example of this could be like noble gases. You could have a smaller number of those. Noble gases, if you were to define it by listing the species, you would say helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. That's the comprehensive way to do it, where you would list every species under there. Again, there are some things we can know all the types and species of, but then there's some things that it'd be really hard for us to do that. It depends on your level of knowledge of the thing or man's even ability to know it in order to do the comprehensive list of species. You could also, or instead of, do a partial. When you're doing a partial list of the species, you still want it to give an adequate amount. So for example, sickness, if I were to do sickness and try to define it by example and listing species, I could say chicken pox and the flu. It's enough there to give information to know what it is, and it's different enough to show like how broad of a type it could be. Which leads me to the second point in this, is like you have to give several differing terms to ensure the definition is complete enough. So for example, when I said vehicle, if I were to say just car, that doesn't show, it's not enough examples to show that the actual definition would be any device that transports people. So you would want to add more things like car, train, and plane, for example. Those are very different, but they're also similar in that they fall under vehicle because they're used to transport people or things. So those are the rules concerning that. The limitation for this one is that it can be vague. So if you've ever experienced this where you're trying to show a kid or tell a kid by example, and then they might clump something else under that term because it wasn't specific enough or they haven't learned it well enough to be able to determine, for example, this is a pillow and that's a cushion. And they might categorize the pillow and the cushion as the same thing until they learn the difference. So these are good ways of learning, and we all learn this way, and we all teach our kids this way. It is just like the first one, which is, what was the first one? Defining by synonym. But the best way, and sometimes the hardest way, is the third, which is defining by genus and difference. Now, if you recall in lesson 1, or if you watched lesson 1, when we were talking about terms and definitions and concepts and all of that, I gave an example that fits perfectly with this. I used the example of dime. Dime was my term, and I defined it as a coin worth 10 cents. So what I did there was I took its genus, which would be coin, and then I added a difference. What distinguishes the dime from any other coin? It's worth 10 cents. This is an example of defining by genus and difference. So how you do this is just like I did with dime. You're going to name the term's genus, which is the broader word or term above it, and the broader category it falls into, and then add a description that sets the term apart from other species of that genus. So, for example, with the dime, the genus was coin, and what set it apart? Its worth. It was worth 10 cents and not 1 cent or 25 cents. Other examples for this would be backpack. A backpack is a bag, which is the genus, that you carry on your back. And carried on the back is the difference. Glasses are lenses. Lenses would be the genus, the broader term, that you wear on your face. That part would be the difference. An author is a person, which would be the genus, who writes books. So if you also remember the dividing principle, this is also, if you can really identify a dividing principle, this helps tremendously in this. So you have your genus, and then you think of the dividing principle between the specific terms underneath it. And then that can be what helps you identify a clear enough distinction between that term and another term under that genus. So the steps in this would be first to choose a genus, and you're going to ask what kind of thing is it. And remember, it's not defining a word, but a term. And if you remember again from lesson 1, a term is a concept that words are used to describe. So you're thinking of what kind of thing is it. After you determine what kind of thing it is, then you're going to determine the difference. Remember that dividing principle that distinguishes it from other things. And it has to be clear enough. So for example, I would not want to define house as a place where people sleep. People do sleep there, but they also sleep other places, like a hotel. So that is not a very good dividing principle. It's not clear enough. The difference also needs to be essential. So for example, I would not want to define president as a man who lives in the White House, because that's not the important part of the president. And also there's other people that can live in the White House. Instead, I would want to be more specific in what divides the president from all other people. And what I could say instead that would be more clear, more specific, would be an elected head of a Republican state. That would be a way better definition there. Another thing to keep in mind when you're defining by genus and difference, although like with my dime example, I started with the genus and then did the difference, the coin worth 10 cents. You don't have to do it in that order. You can put the difference first and the genus second. For example, triangle, a 3-sided polygon. So the 3-sided would be the difference and the polygon would be the genus. So the more broad term is the polygon, and then underneath it, what type of polygon is it? It's a triangle, and that's different because it's 3-sided and it's distinguished by how many sides it has. So these are different methods of defining. Again, as I stated, there's a lot, but we use 3 mostly, and especially in terms of reasoning and learning and communicating. These are 3 good ones to know and we use. To recap them, it's defining by synonym, which is giving a synonym in order to define it. Defining by example, and you can do that by demonstrating through picture or image or listing the species underneath it. And thirdly, defining by genus and difference. This one is the most clear and the best often, and sometimes the hardest to do, but this really helps you distinguish relationship between terms, which is very important when we are getting into reasoning and logic, to be able to identify terms, but also relationships with other terms. So again, this is lesson 4, and we'll see you at a different time for lesson 5.